Very good. Please be seated, everyone. The record should show that the members of the jury have returned to open court. Counsel and Mr. Burns are also here. We are ready to hear the state's next witness.
The state calls Doug Larison.
Good afternoon, Mr. Larison.
Hi.
Please pause and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Go ahead and be seated. Obviously, there is a microphone in front of you, and thank you for positioning that so that we can hear you. Please keep in mind that it's important that only one voice speak at a time, so wait for the attorneys to finish those questions before you begin your answer. They will give you the same courtesy of waiting for you to finish before they ask the next question.
Okay.
Okay? Please tell us your full name and spell your first and last names for the record.
It's Douglas Larison, D-O-U-G-L-A-S. Larison is L-A-R-I-S-O-N.
Thank you. You may proceed with your examination, Mr. Maybank.
Thank you, Your Honor. How old are you?
I'm 58.
And where do you currently live?
I live in Cedar Rapids, Iowa.
How long have you lived there?
Pretty much all my life.
What is your current occupational status?
I'm retired from the Cedar Rapids Police Department, and I'm driving a school bus part-time.
Sounds a lot better than doing this.
I enjoy it.
How long did you work for the Cedar Rapids Police Department?
33 years.
How many years did you spend in law enforcement?
34.
So when did you start the Cedar Rapids Police Department?
It would have been August of 1983.
And when did you leave?
June 1st, 2017.
What positions did you hold with the Cedar Rapids Police Department when you were there?
I was a patrol officer, a traffic officer, and an investigator, and then promoted to detective.
Can you tell us how long you held the position of detective with the Cedar Rapids Police Department?
I think I got promoted in December of 1994.
Did you hold that position then until your retirement?
Yes, I did.
Can you give us a description of the job duties and of the being a detective for the Cedar Rapids Police Department?
Well, we investigate all types of crimes. We have different divisions within the Detective Bureau, such as financial crimes, violent crimes, sex crimes. There's narcotics, there's the DEA task force, FBI task force. Whatever criminal activity there is, we investigate it.
Does that include, at times, being assigned to investigate cold cases?
Yes, it does.
Did you work for a period of time on some cold cases while you were a detective with the Cedar Rapids Police Department?
Yes, I did.
Specifically, did you work on the case involving the homicide of Michelle Martinko?
Yes, I did.
And as a background matter, did you know Michelle Martinko?
I went to school with Michelle Martinko at Kennedy High School.
When did you graduate?
I graduated in '79, so I was 1 year ahead of her.
So were you aware then, in December of 1979, about what had happened to her?
Yes, I was.
To your knowledge, throughout the course of your employment at the Cedar Rapids Police Department, did the murder investigation of Michelle Martinko remain open?
Yes, it was always open.
Did you have an opportunity to do some work on the case?
I did.
Can you tell us under what circumstances you became involved in the investigation?
I became involved in 2004 when I was assigned to follow up on a tip related to the Martinko investigation.
All right. And were you working in your capacity as a detective in 2004?
Yes, I was.
So basically, you started by getting involved and following up a tip.
Following up a tip and started researching the reports and felt that the case could be investigated and followed up on further.
So basically, when you were assigned this tip, you just decided to look into the case a little bit more and read the reports?
Well, exactly. To follow up on the tip, I needed to know some background investigation and try to read as many reports as I could.
So while gathering that background information, did you find that you had some interest in reopening the case and trying to look at some more possible investigation?
Right. What I discovered in researching the case was the partial DNA profile on the gear shift selector of Michelle's car. And the gear shift selector had a blood stain that was collected, and there was 2 DNA profiles mixed together in the blood on the gear shift selector. One was a full profile of Michelle Martinko, and the other was a partial male profile. And my thinking at the time was that we could start going through the case and identifying potential suspects and eliminating them from that partial profile through DNA analysis.
Did your investigation also involve obtaining some items of evidence from your evidence department or your evidence room in preparing those to be resubmitted for further analysis?
Yes, it did. We obtained the dress and the clothing that she was wearing the night she was discovered and submitted those back to the lab for more analysis and investigation.
I'm going to ask you a little bit more about that here in a moment. I want to ask you, Detective Larison, how long did you work on this case?
Well, it would have been over 10 years to the point that I retired. I worked on it close to 10 years and eventually requested that they find somebody else to take my place because I was getting a little bit burned out on it. And I told the supervisors that they should find somebody, get some new blood in on the case.
Okay. And is that person who took over the case here today?
Yeah, Detective Investigator Matt Denlinger.
The gentleman down here on the end of the table?
Yep.
Okay. So after 10 years, did you brief Matt on what you knew and then basically hand it off to him?
Yes, and he consulted with me frequently after he took over the case.
Back to retrieving the clothing worn by Michelle. Can you tell us, kind of take us through what you did to retrieve that clothing and prepare it or access it in order to take it to the lab for more testing?
Sure. I was working with another investigator, Detective George Abowd, and we agreed that we needed to send that evidence back to the lab, so we went down to the Evidence Bureau. We checked out the evidence. We took a look at it, repackaged it, relabeled it, did another lab form, and delivered it to the lab.
And so we're specific about this. When you access the evidence, what evidence are you talking about?
I'm talking about the clothing, the dress, the pantyhose, and the panties.
So you actually took those items out of the package it was in to examine it?
I recall taking the dress out and taking a quick look at the dress, yes.
Okay. And why'd you do that?
We thought it was important that if we're going to investigate the case, that we should at least take a look at the evidence without disturbing it or contaminating it. So we pulled it out, took a quick look, and put it back in its original packaging and then repackaged around that.
What steps did you make sure you took when you reaccessed this item of evidence, took it out to examine it to make sure that the integrity of the item was preserved?
Well, we wore rubber gloves for one thing, and other than that, we tried not to disturb the clothing items, just to get a quick look at them and then reinsert them back in their original packaging and repackage it.
And you said that included a dress, pantyhose, and panties, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. What did you then do with those items of clothing?
We drove them to the state lab and submitted them to the state lab.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
I'll be handing the witness what's been marked and received as State's Exhibit 17O initially here, and I'll have you take a look at that, Detective Larison.
Okay?
And what is that document? If you can recall?
That's the lab form that I filled out to document the chain of evidence on the dress and the clothing items with instructions for the lab.
And we saw this earlier this morning, but can you tell us the day you submitted those items to the laboratory?
October 4th, 2005.
And what items did you submit?
The dress, pantyhose, and the panties, and also her rabbit fur coat, the headliner from her car, the inside door handle from her car, 2 visors from her car, and then a buccal DNA swab from Douglas Caden.
Who was that?
He was a potential suspect in the case that I discovered early on in reading the reports.
And tell us about the transport of that item and how that transpired.
George and I just drove those items to the state lab, and they allowed us entry, and we checked it in. They had us sign the form. I wrote my name on the form and signed my name, and the lab analyst doing the intake work signed the form and took the evidence and gave me a copy of the form.
Did you undertake all the procedures that you had been trained on in the Cedar Rapids Police Department when packaging and then transporting that item to the DCI lab to ensure that the integrity of the item was preserved and there was no alteration, tampering, or substitution?
Yes, we did.
May I approach the witness again, Your Honor?
You may.
This is a 17JI1, I'm sorry, J1. Have you seen that item of evidence, that document before?
Yes, I have.
Does that indicate you on that DCI chain of custody form / Cedar Rapids chain of custody form, again, submitting those aforementioned items in October of 2005?
Yes, it does.
Can I see that for a second?
Yep.
And specifically here on item F here, it says it was submitted by you, received by Ms. Shipman, who we heard from this morning on October 4th, 2005 at 10:32.
That's correct. That's correct.
Detective Larison, is there anything else that occurred of any kind of note at this point in time during the preparation, packaging, and transport of those items?
No, nothing unusual.
Okay. That's all I have for now, Your Honor.
Cross-examination, Mr. Spees.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Larison, in your testimony, you just referred to the men and women of the jury that in preparing to submit material to the DCI laboratory that you opened, examined the dress, and then repackaged it. When Would you recognize the original packaging if you saw it again?
I might, yes.
If I may approach, Your Honor.
You may.
I'm going to hand you what is marked in the blue box in big letters with D1, and up in the upper right-hand corner, F1. Take a minute to look at this exhibit and let us know if you recognize it.
I do recognize it.
And tell us what it is, please.
That's when George and I repackaged her clothing items, and that's George's handwriting, and we did this together. And CRPD Exhibit J and DCI Lab Exhibit F, and it's got the case number.
Okay. And as a matter of fact, I think in the lower right-hand corner are a date about which you just testified, October 4, 2005, right?
Correct.
And that would have been the date that you would have submitted to the lab.
That was the date we submitted it to the lab, correct?
You recognize the initials below the date?
No, I don't.
I think it's Cheryl Shipman.
Okay.
Does that ring a bell?
Yes.
Okay. She was a lab technician that was a custodian of the material he submitted.
Correct.
When you opened up the original packaging of the dress, the panties, and the pantyhose, were the items all bundled together?
As far as I recollect, they were, yes.
Okay. So they were, the dress, the panties, and the pantyhose were in contact with one another?
They were in the same package.
In contact with one another?
I don't remember if they were packaged separately or individually and then packaged together, but they were in the same package that we opened to examine.
If I may approach again, Your Honor.
You may.
Handing you what in the blue box in large letters is Exhibit B1, and up in the upper right-hand corner, D1. Do you recognize what's portrayed in that exhibit?
Yes, I do.
And what is that?
Over here are the pantyhose, and this is like a wrap or a shawl or a scarf that went with the dress.
Okay. And does that resemble, Officer Larison, what you saw in preparing to submit these items back to the lab?
Yes.
After you submitted these materials, namely the dress, the pantyhose, and did you submit the scarf or the shawl as well?
Yes, it was part of the dress.
Okay. After examining those, repackaging them, sending to the DCI laboratory where they were examined by the professional staff there, did you have a conversation with the professional staff after that testing was done? Specifically, did you speak with Linda Sawyer
Yes.
about her findings?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Those are all the questions I have for you.
Redirect Mr. Maybanks.
Your Honor, if I could, just briefly retrieve proposed Exhibit 7A.
You may.
Detective Larison, have you had an opportunity prior to the day to examine proposed Exhibit 7A?
The dress?
Yes, it's addressed, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And when you had an opportunity to examine proposed Exhibit 7A, the dress, does this dress, besides the various areas indicated where DCI testing was performed, appear to be in the same or similar condition as to when you submitted it to the DCI laboratory for examination in October 2005?
Yes, it does.
Your Honor, we have no further questions at this time, however, and as I've brought up with Mr. Spies, we will be requesting to recall Detective Larison at a later date in the trial.
Okay. Additional cross-examination at this time,
Just
Mr.
one
Spies?
question. Officer Larison, when you submitted the dress, proposed Exhibit 7A, to the Criminalistics Laboratory, did you notice that it had rabbit fur on it?
No, I did not.
Thank you.
Anything further at this time?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. Thank you, Detective Larison. You may step down.
Thank you.
State may call its next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state calls Linda Sauer.
Good afternoon. You can make your way over to the witness chair. Careful of the stairs. Thank you. Good afternoon. I would ask you to please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
All right. A couple of rules that we have in the courtroom. Only one voice can speak at a time, so I would ask you to please wait for the attorneys to finish any question before you start your answer. They will give you the same courtesy of making sure that you complete your answer before they ask another question.
Thank you.
And be mindful of that microphone. We want to hear what you have to tell us this afternoon, okay? And you can adjust that so that it's comfortable for you. Very good. And if you'd please tell us your full name and spell your first and last names for the record.
My name is Linda R. Sauer. My first name is spelled Linda. My last name is spelled Sawer.
Thank you. You may proceed with your examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon. Can I call you Mrs. Sawyer or Linda? Or
Whatever.
okay.
Linda's
All right.
fine.
Well, I was raised to ask when
Oh,
first.
yes.
Okay, Linda, can you tell us where you're from first?
I live in Ames, Iowa now. I grew up in Des Moines.
Are you currently working or are you retired?
I am retired.
And where are you retired from?
My last place of employment was the Iowa Criminalistics Laboratory. At that time, it was part of DCI. Now they've reorganized, and I think it's just part of public safety.
Okay. So, what do you do with your time?
What do I do with my time?
Yeah.
Well, I read. I do a few crafts. I'm on the computer a lot. But that's mostly it.
When we came to your house to talk to you, you said you also did some neighborhood watch?
Well, yes. Just one family has a young family, and 3 of us around them that are retired.
Oh.
So we have them covered.
All right, Linda, thanks. I'm going to have you tell us a little bit about your background here. Did you spend your entire career with the DCI lab?
No, I didn't. I started my career as a teacher in the Peace Corps in Ghana, which is in West Africa. And while there, I met a gentleman I liked, and so I married and stayed 9 years. Then we returned to the States, and my first job was at the University of Iowa, Des Moines branch, hygienics lab. and they are the environmental and health testing facilities for the state of Iowa.
What'd you do there?
I did blood lead screening on children, and just blood lead screening on children. And the neonatal screening that they do on newborns, they take the little sample from the heel. So we did that. And then the last 2 years I was there, I was an industrial hygiene chemist.
Okay. Did you have an educational background in chemistry or biology?
I had a degree in biology.
So what happened with the University of Iowa Hygienics Laboratory? Did you stay there or move on?
No, I moved upstairs in the same building to the DCI crime lab.
All right. What was your first position with the crime lab?
I've always been in the same section. It was first called the serology section. Serology is the study of blood and other body fluids. And so we would do what we could at that time in terms of differentiating blood. We used the ABO system, the MN system, secretor status, but we couldn't do very much.
Well, you were just kind of learning that area then? Or that area was just beginning, I guess?
Oh, that area?
Yeah.
No, it kept expanding. They would find more possible markers. Sometimes you'd only find them in one fluid, though, so didn't help you as much. That also included hair analysis. I should say hair comparisons.
You said hair?
Yes.
Okay. What did that involve at that time?
Well, sometimes we would get animal hair, and from a conservation officer who wanted us to see if it was deer hair. Those were important cases, deer out of season.
Oh, okay. Well, you guys do everything there then?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And then sometimes we would have questionnaires from a crime scene, and we would be asked to compare them to knowns from certain individuals. Hair is not uniform on your head, and they're not even uniform from near the head to the tip. They kind of change their features. So the best we could ever say was that a hair was similar to and could have come by from that person. It wasn't until DNA that we could establish identity.
What other kind of positions did you hold at the laboratory?
I was always in the same section. We just switched from serology to DNA.
When did that take place?
Where did the
switch from serology into DNA?
when?
Yeah.
Well, it started in the 90s, early 90s. But I don't think we were online for full DNA testing until maybe 95 or 96.
Tell us a little bit about your memory of how the DNA forensic technology and science came to the lab and what you guys did with it, over the years.
Well, it's been 15 years since I did any of that, so I might be a little rusty. We started out using a technique that was called dot blot. And you had, I think we had 6 different areas or loci of DNA that were spotted on a little strip of very thin paper. And you would apply your sample at one end of that, and then it would be processed, and where the feature was present in that person's profile, a blue dot would appear. So it was a way, so for each of the systems, we would have one strip, and so we would probably have, I think we did maybe 4 or 6 of those at a time. We didn't do that for very long.
Okay. As that technology then was replaced, what came next?
What came next was STRs, and STR stands for short tandem repeats.
And I want to ask you a little bit more about that, but if you wouldn't mind, can you give us a rundown, sort of the training that you received in that DNA area?
Oh, well, in addition to the in-lab training with Mike Peterson, also went to the FBI Academy for a 2-week course in basic DNA technology. And later I attended another 2-week class in California, run by the people who made the instruments that we used. And there again, there was, some theory and explanation of the STR process. Attended various workshops on the reagents, the interpretation, other types of things at professional meetings.
May I approach witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Behind the witness, what's been marked as State's Exhibit CV, as in Victory, 2. I ask you, Linda, do you recognize that document?
I do.
Hey, what is that?
This is my resume or qualifications, including basic education and then whatever forensic science workshops and courses I attended.
Does that document include a summary of the trainings and of the various qualifications that you earned in the field of DNA forensics and testing as of, I think is it April 28th of 2008? Is that the date on the front?
The date on the front, April 28th, 2008, yes.
Okay. And was that the last time then it was updated?
Yes.
Okay. That was near your retirement then?
Yeah, I retired in 2009.
At the time that you conducted DNA analysis in this case, which we'll get to here shortly, in 2002, 2003, and 2005, had you received the necessary updated training in the matters of testing that you employed on the evidence in this case?
Yes.
First, we'd like to move to admit C, V as in Victory, 2.
Any objection to CV2?
No objection, Your Honor. Thank you.
The court will receive and make part of today's record states CV2.
And we request at this time that that Ms. Sauer, that Linda be recognized as an expert in the fields that she testified to today and is contained in her CV2 for the years that I just mentioned.
Any objection to that designation?
Your Honor, I don't think the court's recognition of the witness as an expert is necessary. It's up for the jury to determine the weight of her evidence.
Absolutely. Okay. But you may proceed to testify in the areas in which you have experience and training.
Thank you.
I'll take that from you there.
I think we had gotten up to the point where you were going to tell us about the STR testing and what you had learned about that method.
So the name itself kind of describes what type of DNA we were looking at. They were relatively short pieces of DNA. we have literally hundreds of thousands, maybe billions of those pairs, the A, the T, the C, and the G, that make up the code for the DNA. And so if you were looking at like maybe 150 length, that would be considered a short length. It says tandem because we're talking about units that were next to each other, just like in a tandem bicycle. And they're repeats. So one repeat would have its code, and then that segment would be repeated a certain number of times. And so people do not differ in the code, they differ in the number of copies of the code. So this type of DNA fills space between the type that we call genes, and so it doesn't code for genes.
And how were you trained in accessing or being able to view these short tandem repeats? What process was used for that?
Okay, it's called PCR, which stands for polymerase chain reaction. Polymerase is the name of the enzyme that works to allow fragments of DNA to be replicated. And the advantage of STRs over the early techniques was that you don't need as much DNA to start with. When DNA first started, they used an X-ray method, and you had to do gels and all sorts of transformations. And they needed maybe a blood stain the size of a quarter in order to be successful. With STRs, because we're making copies of the DNA that are present in that sample, a blood stain probably a quarter an inch across will work. So it was faster, it was cheaper because it required less lab time, and it could do smaller samples.
How were
how was the DNA, you said it was put into a repeat mode. How was it amplified so you could see it?
I think maybe I should start with how we find the DNA sample.
Go ahead.
And sometimes we would receive a stain or a swab from an individual, and we called those knowns because we knew the person they came from. And then we would have the question or the samples we received from the evidence. If it was an object like it was fabric, we would locate the stain and then take a sample of it. First, we would screen it for the presence of blood to make sure it wasn't something else. On the black dress, or on any black item, it's very difficult to see a blood stain. And so usually we would look at it with a very strong light source. And if you kind of shine it across the surface, you can then sometimes see changes in the texture of the fabric. And so we note those and see whether or not they are blood. For fabric, take a cutting of a suitable size, and then by a method that is called extraction, we would get the DNA from the fabric, which we would call the substrate, into solution. So then we would know, or if we had DNA, that's where it would be in the solution from the fabric. After that, it was best to have at least a ballpark idea of how much DNA was there. Was it very concentrated or was it dilute? The reagents that we purchased for the testing had a window of like what the concentration was best to be. So that's what we would do next step. We called it quantitation. Based on the quantitation, we would then add a certain amount of our sample to a reagent mix. And it would go into, looks like maybe like a big printer, but it had little areas in a metal plate to put these tiny little tubes. So the tubes were pretty much, except for the top, surrounded by metal. And what the machine did was to heat the sample to the point that the DNA would separate into the two strands. So we start out as a double helix, a ladder that's twisted. And then when DNA is going to replicate, it straightens itself out, and the bonds on the rungs of the ladder split apart to give us the two different sides. During the next stage after they were broken apart would be to cool it down to about 60 degrees centigrade, and that was a suitable point for the reagents which included the items needed to replicate the DNA. And they would fill in where there wasn't a pair. So if on one side you had had before TA, then you would now have, this side had T's, but no longer has its buddy, the A. So A's would fill in this side, and T's would fill in this side. So at the end of one amplification, you would have two copies instead of one. And that was repeated over and over. I don't quite remember how many cycles. I think it was 28 or 30, and that would give you enough DNA to then run through an analyzer.
So
basically, you're making multiple copies of that same DNA. So you took something that was small, but with multiple copies, it's easier to see.
Right.
But it's the same DNA.
It would be the same sequence.
And the sequence is how you read the DNA.
Yes.
And interpret it, correct?
Yes.
Was that the process, this PCR, polymerase chain reaction, short tandem repeat that you were using then on or about 2002?
Yes.
I want to get into the testing here shortly, but when Mr. Peterson was here, we gave him a chance to answer this question, and we're not going to let a DNA expert leave here without getting a shot at it. So why don't you tell us in your terms how you describe what DNA is?
DNA is a long molecule that carries the information that we call genes. It has areas that control reactions within our body. And some of those reactions are visible on us and some aren't. We all have things that produce our hormones and our enzymes and things. We also have genes that tell us which type of muscle, because we have 3 different types of muscle. We have skeletal muscle, we have smooth muscle that we have like in our intestines and stomach, and then we have cardiac muscle. So it doesn't say just make muscle, it's which type. And so it's truly marvelous what, DNA controls from when an egg is fertilized until it becomes a baby. All of those instructions are there in the DNA. And each cell in your body has a complete set of these instructions, except for what we call the germ cells, which would be the egg and the sperm. And they only have half. They have 1 strand of the DNA, so that when the egg is fertilized, it will again have a complete copy.
And along those lines, you basically have answered it, but what would you say it is about DNA that makes us individuals and who we are?
Well, we do vary, as I say, in this particular type of DNA that we were looking only at the length of a segment. And at that time, we didn't know of any particular use that had, other than to maybe separate genes and make the molecule stable. I don't know whether they found since then or not. But then there are the other kinds that will code for traits that we can see or that we can test for. And one example is sickle cell anemia. If you've heard of that, it is a special type of very painful anemia that is found mostly among sub-Saharan Africans and people in the Mediterranean region. The hemoglobin from people with sickle cell differs from the normal hemoglobin in only 1 letter. And yet just that 1 letter difference makes a huge difference to the individual. Likewise, genes are responsible for the pigment color, in your eye, your ABO blood type, those things.
Okay, on a related but somewhat different viewpoint, what is it about DNA, for instance, that would make individuals who are related, like brothers or sisters or cousins, different?
Well, when you look at that each parent will have 2 genes for each characteristic, and only 1 of those goes into the reproductive cells. So you can figure out that for a particular trait, the mother would have 2 types of eggs, with 1 of her types in 1 egg, 1 in the other. The sperm would also do that. So they could be combined in a number of different ways. They could have combined in the same way that one of the parents' type was, or they could be a mixture of the 2 so that they would have a different type than either the mother or the father. So each of the children in a family would essentially have the same 4 copies as possibilities, but they probably would not have the same combination. And I've simplified it by saying a copy. And actually, since we're looking at segments that repeat the letters over and over, then there are many ways that people could be brothers and sisters and not have exactly the same. but we expect that, there are parts of the DNA that will be the same.
Through your tenure at the DCI, did you perform DNA analysis for a variety of criminal investigations?
Yes.
And were the analysis methods that you used, that you just described, generally accepted in the area of DNA forensic analysis by other laboratories across the nation?
Yes.
As a DNA criminalist, did you testify in court as an expert on those matters?
I did.
And for the record, as of February of 2002, what method of DNA analysis was the DCI laboratory doing?
We were doing the STRs using the PCR technology.
In 2002, do you recall receiving a black dress that was associated with a victim of a homicide by the name of Michelle Martinko in your laboratory for DNA analysis and testing?
Upon reminders, when people came to ask me about it, seeing photographs, I did remember it. But without a nudge, I didn't.
Well, you tested this dress more than once, right?
Yes, I did.
So after being reminded of the work and seeing that documentation, did you remember the dress then?
Oh, yes.
Okay. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Handing the witness what's already been received as states Exhibit 17M. And I'm just going to point out a couple of things in here, Linda, on this exhibit. First, it looks like on March 15th, if we could get that up to, of 2002, there's a note that what was described as item F, the dress in this case, was ready for you to pick up to analyze. Does that coincide with what your review of the documentation when you first analyzed the dress?
Yes.
And then again, in June 16th of 2003, there's another 2003, excuse me, there's another indication that the dress was ready for you to pick up. Does that coincide with your memory of the second time that you reviewed the dress?
Yes.
And then finally, on October 13th of 2005, there's a note here that the dress was ready for you to pick up to analyze. Does that coincide with your recollection of when you analyzed it the third time?
Yes.
May I again retrieve State's Proposed Exhibit 7A, Your Honor?
You may.
I'm not going to make you get down, Linda. I'm just going to bring this over to you right here and show you State's Proposed Exhibit 7A, which is been described as the black dress that Michelle Martinko was wearing, that has been tested and has been described by other witnesses in this case. Do you recognize this?
I do.
And after looking at this dress, did you have an opportunity to note on the dress areas where you took notes of where extractions or testing were done?
Yes.
And does that include the front area of the dress as well as the
Back.
back of the dress?
Yes.
Does this appear to you to be in relatively the same condition as when You tested it after it coming into your custody in 2002, 2003, and finally in 2005.
Actually, my memory is mostly from 2005. And yes, it does look the same.
Okay.
Do you also recall, after reviewing documentation in this case, that you performed a DNA examination on an exhibit described as Exhibit I, blood from the gear shift selector?
Yes,
After receiving the dress on 3 occasions and conducting an analysis of it, do you recall that you completed reports regarding your findings?
yes,
And same for the blood from the gear shift selector. Do you recall, after receiving that you compiled a report for your findings for that in 2002?
I remember.
Prior to conducting your own examination of the dress and the blood from the gear selector, had there been previous testing that had been conducted by an analyst by the name of Michael Peterson?
Yes.
May I approach witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Have a copy. Yeah, just 1 second here, Linda. Would you have reviewed the report by Mr. Peterson as part of your review and testing of the dress when you received it?
I don't think so.
Have you had a chance to look at it before today's date?
No. I had Mr. Peterson right there,
Okay,
so he could tell me what he did.
all right. So did you talk to Mr. Peterson about what he did with the dress then?
I probably did,
Okay.
and I probably asked his opinion as to what he thought would be appropriate to do with it.
May I approach witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Okay. In the hand of the witness must have been marked as State's Exhibit 9B. B is in boy.
2-page document here, Linda. I'm going to ask you first if you've seen this before.
I have.
Okay. And generally, what is State's Exhibit 9B?
It is a report issued with my signature on 7/31/2002, describing the analysis and observations on, looks like there are 5 exhibits here.
And what 5 exhibits does it show analysis and observation for?
Exhibit F, Exhibit I, which was the gear shift selector knob, Exhibit J, which I believe was a hair, Exhibit H, which I don't remember what it was, but it didn't have any DNA on it. And then K was cigarette butts.
And in this report, does it indicate that you performed the STR testing that you described for us previously?
Yes.
You mentioned Exhibit F, but based upon your review of the documentation, does that refer to the dress?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell us how you performed the analysis of the dress in 2002 to the best of your recollection?
I don't think I did. Did I do DNA on that? Yes. The blood sample I obtained from the dress the first time gave me a complete result. All of the different segments that we normally would test for, there were 15 of them. I believe that the purpose was to establish what was most likely the DNA profile of the owner of the dress, Michelle Martinko.
And were you able then, I think you indicated, to develop a complete profile from the dress?
Yes,
And was that profile then determined based upon your investigation to be the complete profile of the victim, Michelle Martinko?
that's an assumption I'm making.
And that assumption was based upon
The fact that she had had injuries that resulted in bleeding, and she was wearing the black dress at the time.
And did you conduct some analysis of the item Exhibit I, the blood from the gear shift selector?
I did.
Can you tell us how you conducted that analysis?
Okay, so that was a hard surface, and my memory tells me it was not a heavy stain that you could like scrape off, but rather was a smear, like it had been touched glancingly, not held tightly. And so I used a cotton tip swab that had been moistened with distilled water to collect the stain, the smear.
And once you did that, did you perform the STR method of analysis that you described for us?
Yes,
Does this report contain your findings and conclusions from that analysis?
it does.
And does this report also contain findings from your analysis of the other items that you mentioned as well as done by the STR testing?
Yes,
Is this a fair and accurate copy of your report?
yes,
And is this something that was kept in the regular course of business activity by the DCI lab?
yes.
Move to admit 9B as in boy.
Have you had an opportunity to inspect that proposed exhibit, Mr. Spees?
Yes, I have, Your Honor. We have no objection.
The court will receive and make part of today's record states Exhibit 9B as in boy.
Permission to publish, Your Honor?
You may.
And Linda, you can keep that exhibit in front of you so you don't have to turn around and look at it, but it's going to appear over the top of you as well,
Okay.
so we all can follow along. And before we talk about this, I just have a couple other questions. Could you tell us, based upon your training and the protocol and procedure that you use at the laboratory, about how you ensured that the items of evidence that you handled was done in a way to preserve the integrity of the items and to prevent any alteration, substituting, or tampering?
All right. First of all, we would always place white paper underneath the exhibit we were going to examine. So even before opening the package, we have a like butcher paper. And then after opening it, first thing we do is to put an identity tag on it, our initials and date, the case number, and the exhibit designation. So it was one item at a time would be examined. If an area of interest, an area that stained positive for blood, and blood was what I was looking for, then I would select areas to extract DNA from. To do this, we just take a cutting, usually with a pair of scissors, and the scissors are cleaned with alcohol between each use. If it's a swab, cotton tip swab, we would use a single edge razor blade, and we would cut that in half and peel off part of it using forceps. We always wore gloves. Gloves were changed between each item. For the extraction, the sample would be put in a little tube about this high, and it had a narrowed at the bottom. They could be centrifuged to spin them down to separate solid material from that in solution. But each one came to the laboratory DNA-free. And we would open the tube using a special tool, which wasn't very difficult. And it actually, the closest thing to remind is like a beer bottle opener, where it had an edge that you could put under the lid and flip it open so that you didn't touch the inside, of the tube. The cutting would then be placed in there, and the lid would be closed, and that would be set aside until you had another sample to add.
Thanks, Linda. Can I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Just briefly, the previously received in evidence was State's Exhibit 17I. This is a DCI form that has already been described as the chain of custody form involving Exhibit F and Exhibit I here as submitted to the laboratory. You'll see that it's described as victim's dress, pantyhose, and panties. Does that cause you any, well, the fact that these items were all what the victim submitted together, does that cause you any concern or just on the face of it?
Generally, if items are in a dry state, they are not moist, material will not be transferred, like DNA or a blood stain, from one piece to another. And so that was the usual state. Sometimes items would be packaged separately. Other times, they would be packaged, together.
And when those items were packaged together, was it sometimes under the circumstances such as this, as involving items from the same individual?
Yes.
Moving down then with the exhibit here, you already described to us your findings involving the dress. So in that paragraph where it says F, I, and J, that first sentence, does that describe that you found the complete profile from the dress that you determined for the reasons you stated was Michelle?
Yes.
And then from that testing, were you able to perform or able to determine whether it was a female or male profile?
Yes, it was female.
Okay. And going down then to Exhibit I and your findings in Exhibit I, what can you tell us what those findings mean and how you reached them?
Okay, so I described how I would have taken some of the stain off the gear shift selector, put it on a swab, then you wait for the swab to dry, and then cut portion of the swab and put it in for extraction. Then the same DNA technology, reagents and everything that were used for the stain on the dress were also used for the blood collected off the shift selector. The results were not as complete. There were only results at 9 of the STR loci. Loci just means place. And what we call the sexing locus, amylogenin. So male and female differ in their amylogenin results. That's how we can tell whether it's a male or a female.
And so did you find, as this report indicates, a mixture of DNA from Exhibit I?
I did.
And the report says you found at least one male and one female contributor to those results. Is that right?
Yes.
Explain what you mean then by the donor of the DNA from Exhibit F cannot be eliminated as a contributor.
So it means of the loci that were developed, the results found matched the same loci on the dress F. Now, since it's not a complete, the eye sample was not as strong, there were other areas that just didn't appear. So it wasn't as good a match.
And how were you able then to determine that the mixture also involved a male? Did it have a result at the sexing locus? Is that?
Yes, so I believe it would have shown an X, which is the female marker, with a taller peak than the Y, and the Y is the male.
So were you able to say with confidence then that you were able to find the mixture that had both a male and female contributing?
Yes.
And you wrote in here that you eliminated James Sturtz, presumably a suspect that was provided as a known. You were able to do that from comparing it to the male contributor?
Yes.
So what you were able to gather from the profile that you developed involving the male, was that enough for comparison purposes then?
Well, yes, you only have to find one difference in a blood sample you're comparing it to say that this person couldn't be the source, because the unknown sample has results that are, say, 15 units and 17 units long, and the known only had 13. So someone who has the result of 13 cannot donate a 15 or a 17.
Okay. Makes sense. So what's done as a matter of protocol at the DCI lab at that time once you're done with the testing of these items?
Okay, when the analysis is completed, usually after each item is completed, it will be at least stapled shut. If you think you might have to take another sample from that item, you don't go ahead and tape it. But it would be stapled shut, folded over, a paper sack. And so the items would have been basically replaced in the packaging. But I would wait until after the report was complete before I would return them to the evidence room.
Were there, and after the return to the evidence room, was that then when they were held until returned to the agency, to your knowledge?
Yes.
Were there situations when there were samples that were retained at the laboratory?
Yes, if an item had a very limited amount of a sample and I was consuming most of that in the analysis, the extract would be saved in a long-term storage freezer.
And was that freezer that was on site at the laboratory?
Yes.
Did you have an opportunity to conduct another examination of Exhibit F, the dress in this case, in 2003 at the date that we discussed in your previous testimony?
Yes.
Yeah. As a result of receiving that item, again, did you conduct further DNA analysis and testing on it?
Yes.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Be handing the witness what I've marked as 9C and ask you, Linda, do you recognize that? I think it's just a one-page document, right?
Yes, it has my signature.
Okay. Is that a report that you compiled as a result of your second analysis of the dress in 2003 I think our date is September 8th of 2003.
Okay, that was the report date.
Okay.
It would have been examined earlier.
And I think one of our other exhibits, it looked like you checked it out maybe in June and did some testing on it. Is that right?
Yes,
And is that a report, too, that's kept in the regular course of business at the DCI?
yes.
Let's talk about the analysis that you did in that instance there, and let's just focus, if we could, on the dress.
All right. I believe I was asked to test multiple areas if I could to see if the stains were consistent with each other. And one of the stains was a relatively crusty area. When blood has been thick and it dries, it forms like paint chips would come off of things. So I used that one. And then I was able to view another possible stain. And so that one was screened for the presence of blood, and it did show the sign of blood. So that was another area that I selected. And I also examined the dress using a high-intensity light that is called an alternative light source. And you can use different wavelengths, and some things fluoresce under the light, like saliva. If you have a saliva stain on your shirt, I may not be able to see it, but it will fluoresce. It will light up. Blood does not fluoresce, but you can sometimes tell a difference in the texture of the fabric by shining the light horizontally across the surface. And I identified 2 additional areas of interest, and they also showed the presence of blood.
And when you were able to identify those areas that showed the presence of blood, did you do the screening test on it to see if it was blood?
Yes,
Okay. And was it?
yes, that's how I knew it was blood.
Okay. And so once you did that, did you conduct further examination to attempt to identify a DNA profile?
Yes, I did the regular testing, extraction, quantitating, amplifying, and analyzing.
And so we don't have to go back over that. Was that the same procedure you used in 2002?
Yes,
Okay. And after you conducted that testing, were you able to reach some conclusions and report some findings in that report?
yes, it said that the 3 blood-stained areas from the front and 1 from the back were sampled, and they developed female profiles that match each other and the profile from the earlier testing in 2002.
We move to admit State's Exhibit 9C, Your Honor.
Any objection to 9C?
No objection.
The court will receive and make part of today's record State's Exhibit 9C.
And may I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Any witness what I marked as 9C1. Linda, do you recognize 9C1? It appears to be a stapled together 2-page document here.
Yes.
Is that, what is that exhibit?
These are my bench notes, notes that I would take while I was examining the item.
And what's the purpose of taking those notes, or what do they
Well,
document?
to describe what you're doing, what you're observing, and to be a basis for memory later on if you need to recount.
Okay. And have you had a chance to review that today?
Yes,
Well, so did it serve its purpose? Does it help you remember?
well, at least I understand it, yes.
All right. And tell us then, on your report that we just looked at, you described the items in your report as a black dress, a black scarf, a pair of pantyhose, and a pair of underwear, right?
Yes,
And is that what you found when you opened up the package to examine it?
yes,
Okay. And is that noted in your notes as well?
yes.
And how would you describe that scarf?
I felt it was an item that had been used as a wrap. And I don't remember whether the fabrics were exactly the same, so it could have come from the dress or it could have been something purchased separately.
Did it look like it was an item of attire that's worn with the dress?
Yes.
And other than the findings that we talked about with regard to that submission in 2003, where you found 3 bloodstain areas from the front and 1 from the back that matched the profile of the earlier one in 2002, did you find anything else with respect to the dress?
No.
Okay. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
We hand the witness what's been marked as State's Exhibit 9D as in dog. Leave it out so you can look at it. Here you go. You recognize that exhibit?
Yes.
And what is that?
This is report number 3, issued in 12/05 of 2005, and it does bear my signature.
And so, again, is this a report that you authored?
Yes.
Does this contain the results of DNA testing and analysis you performed on various exhibits submitted to you by the Cedar Rapids Police Department? That also includes, again, Exhibit F, the black dress worn by Michelle.
Yes.
Does that appear to be a fair and accurate copy of your report?
Yes.
Can you tell us, if you could, how the dress was examined when you received it, as indicated by previous exhibits in your testimony in October of 2005 through when you completed the report?
Well, again, I examined the dress using the intense light beam to try and locate additional possible stains. I was selecting stains from as wide an area as I could, not like all together. So I found some from the side, some from the front, and some from the back. And 4 additional stains that did screen positive for blood were cut for DNA analysis.
And when you conducted DNA analysis of those 4 additional stains taken from 4 additional areas, did you perform the same STR testing that you described for us earlier?
Yes, I did.
And I didn't ask you this before, I'll just ask it to cover it. Were all the same safety procedures taken in
Oh,
all
yes,
these?
all the same.
As a result of that, analyzing them through the STR method you described earlier, did you come to some conclusions and findings regarding your further analysis of these 4 additional areas of blood?
Yes.
Okay. At this point in time, Your Honor, we move to admit State's Exhibit 9D as in dog.
Any objection to 9D?
Without objection.
The court will receive and make part of today's record State's Exhibit 9D. And we are going to give everyone a break. We're going to be in recess for about 15 minutes. Please bear in mind that admonition, folks, and we'll see you back in about 15 minutes. We'll be in recess.
Please rise for the jury. You can leave your notebooks on your chairs.
Is it okay if I just sit here? Is it okay if I just